Under the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights, a security guard named Alan settled into his nightly routine at Holloway Industries, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The factory had shut down years ago, and whispers about its closure spoke of terrible accidents, unexplained disappearances, and screams that echoed through the iron corridors long after the machines had stopped. Alan had heard the stories, but brushed them off as local legends. The job paid well, and he needed the money. His duties were straightforward: patrol the perimeter, ensure no vandals or thrill-seekers entered, and stay awake until dawn. With his flashlight in hand and a thermos of coffee, he began his rounds. The first few hours passed uneventfully, with only the occasional creak of settling metal or distant howls of the wind to keep him company. Around midnight, as Alan approached the heart of the factory, his flashlight flickered and died. He smacked it against his palm, muttering curses under his breath, when a cold draft brushed past him, carrying a faint, metallic scent. It was oddly familiar, like rust mixed with something sharper: blood. Ignoring the shiver that crawled up his spine, Alan pressed on. His backup flashlight cast long, unsettling shadows along the walls, transforming mundane pipes into twisted limbs. As he turned a corner, he froze. In the distance, a figure stood motionless at the far end of the hallway. It was too dark to make out details, but its outline was unmistakable: tall, thin, and unnervingly still. "Hey!" Alan called, his voice firm but wavering. "This is private property. You need to leave." The figure didn't move. Alan's grip on his flashlight tightened as he slowly approached. "I'm calling the police," he warned, but his words felt hollow in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, the figure shifted, not toward him but sideways, slipping into a doorway with an unnatural fluidity. Alan quickened his pace, reaching the doorway within seconds, but when he shone his light inside, the room was empty. A chill settled over him as he realized the room had no other exits. His radio crackled to life, static filling the air. Among the distortion, a voice whispered his name, drawn out and haunting. "Alan." It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably his name. His heart raced as he brought the radio to his lips. "Who's there?" he demanded, but only static replied. The factory seemed to come alive after that. Footsteps echoed in the corridors, always just out of sight. Machines long dormant hummed faintly, their rusted gears groaning as if yearning to move again. Doors slammed shut in the distance, and faint whispers carried through the air, too fragmented to understand but filled with malice. Desperate to end his shift, Alan retreated to the security office. The monitors, once showing static views of empty hallways, now displayed something far more sinister. Dark silhouettes moved erratically, darting between shadows, their faces obscured. One camera feed showed the break room where he'd left his coffee. A woman stood there, her back to the camera. She wore an outdated factory uniform, her hair matted and wet. As Alan stared, she slowly turned her head toward the camera, revealing empty eye sockets and a mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Alan scrambled to turn off the monitors, but the images persisted. The woman began walking toward the security office, appearing on each camera feed as she drew closer. He slammed the office door shut and locked it, his breathing ragged. Then came the knock. It was slow, deliberate, and echoed in the small room. "Let me in," a voice whispered from the other side, soft, almost sweet, but dripping with menace. "I just want to talk." Alan backed away from the door, his mind racing for a plan. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until the door rattled on its hinges. Just as he thought it would give way, everything stopped. Silence enveloped the room, heavy and suffocating. Cautiously, Alan opened the door. The hallway was empty, but something had changed. Written on the walls in dark, dripping letters was a single word: run. He didn't hesitate. Grabbing his keys, Alan bolted for the exit, his footsteps echoing through the factory. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers followed him, growing louder, more frantic. By the time he reached his car, his breath came in panicked gasps. He fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and sped away without looking back. Alan never returned to Holloway Industries, but the nightmares did. Each night, he dreamed of that factory, of the whispers, the figures in the shadows, and the woman with the empty eyes. And every morning, he woke with the same message etched into his fogged-up mirror: "You can't escape."
Story number 2.
In a quiet, unremarkable town, a young man named Greg took up a night shift as a security guard at Ravenswood Mall. The mall had been closed for nearly a decade, its once bustling halls now empty and decaying. Rumors swirled among the locals, whispers of strange occurrences, ghostly apparitions, and something deeply unsettling in the abandoned arcade. But Greg wasn't one for ghost stories. He needed the paycheck, and the job seemed easy enough. His first night began without incident. Armed with a flashlight and a cheap walkie-talkie, Greg made his rounds, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off the crumbling walls. The air inside the mall was heavy, laced with the faint smell of mildew and something sharper like burnt plastic. The faint creaks and groans of the structure settling were easy to dismiss, at least at first. Around 1 a.m., Greg reached the food court. The chairs were stacked haphazardly on tables, and graffiti covered the walls. As he scanned the area, his flashlight caught something that made him freeze. One of the chairs was upright on the floor. He distinctly remembered all of them being stacked when he'd passed by earlier. "Probably just my imagination," he muttered, but his voice sounded hollow in the vast emptiness. He righted the chair and continued his patrol. As he approached the arcade, his flashlight flickered. The air grew colder, biting at his skin. The arcade had been a popular attraction in its heyday, filled with neon lights and the sounds of digital battles. Now the machines stood silent, their screens dark and dusty, except for one. At the far end of the room, a claw machine buzzed faintly, its interior light casting an eerie glow. Greg approached cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The claw moved on its own, descending into the pile of dusty toys and trinkets. When it rose again, it gripped something small and black. The prize dropped into the chute with a hollow clunk. Greg hesitated, then reached into the machine. His fingers brushed against a small object. Pulling it out, he realized it was an old, battered walkie-talkie, identical to the one clipped to his belt. Before he could process what he was holding, the device crackled to life. "Greg," a distorted voice hissed. "Why are you here?" His stomach churned. He dropped the walkie-talkie and stumbled backward. The claw machine's light blinked off, plunging the arcade into darkness. From behind him, the sound of jingling coins broke the silence. He spun around, shining his flashlight wildly, but saw nothing. And then came the laughter. Soft, childlike giggles echoed through the arcade, growing louder, closer. Greg's breath quickened. He backed away, his flashlight beam trembling as he scanned the room. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper, barely audible but sharp enough to pierce his mind. "Run." Greg didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from the arcade, his footsteps pounding against the tiled floor. The air felt heavier with every step, as though the mall itself were trying to hold him back. The lights above flickered violently, and the distant sound of footsteps followed him. Too fast, too erratic to be human. Reaching the security office, Greg slammed the door shut and locked it. He leaned against it, gasping for breath, his heart pounding like a drum. The monitors showed static, but amidst the interference, faint shapes moved across the screens. Figures darting through the hallways, their forms distorted and wrong. Suddenly, one screen cleared. It showed the hallway outside the security office. A figure stood just outside the door, its back to the camera. It was tall, with unnaturally long limbs and a head tilted at an impossible angle. Slowly, it turned toward the camera, revealing a face devoid of features, just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. The doorknob rattled. Greg stumbled back, his mind racing. The pounding on the door grew louder, more violent. The walls of the office seemed to close in, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, silence. The pounding stopped. The monitors flickered off, leaving Greg in complete darkness. He held his breath, straining to hear any sound. A faint whisper filled the room, coming from right behind him. "You're already too late." Greg turned, his scream swallowed by the darkness. When the mall reopened for inspection weeks later, they found the security office empty. The chair tipped over and the monitors shattered, but etched into the desk, deep and jagged, was a single word: stay. No one took the night shift at Ravenswood Mall again.
Story number 3.
Sam was a night guard at Black Hollow Cemetery, a sprawling graveyard infamous for its size and its unsettling history. Local legends told of strange happenings, phantom figures, whispers on the wind, and graves that sometimes seemed to shift or change overnight. But Sam wasn't one to believe in such tales. He'd taken the job for the solitude, hoping the quiet would help him sort through his own troubled thoughts. The cemetery stretched on for miles, its tombstones and crypts bathed in the cold, silver glow of the moon. Sam's tiny guard shack was situated near the entrance, equipped with little more than a space heater, a battered radio, and a flashlight with questionable battery life. His task was simple: walk the grounds a few times each night and ensure no vandals or trespassers disturbed the dead. At 2 a.m., the first sign that something was wrong occurred. As Sam patrolled the oldest section of the graveyard, he noticed a grave that had been freshly dug, the mound of earth piled high beside it. That alone wouldn't have been strange. Graves were prepared in advance, but the headstone bore a name he knew too well. Samuel Porter. Sam froze, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the stone. Beneath his name were the dates of his birth and his death. The latter was today. "This has to be some sick joke," he muttered, his voice shaking. "Someone's messing with me." Determined to prove it was a prank, he leaned closer, running his hand over the engraving. It was cold and smooth, like all the others, but the letters seemed unnervingly deep, as though carved by some unseen hand with incredible precision. A faint rustling behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight across the rows of graves. The beam caught movement, a shadow slipping between the stones, that too large to be an animal. "Hey, who's out there?" Sam called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No answer, only silence. As he walked toward where the figure had been, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, bone-chilling whisper. It wasn't in any language Sam recognized, but the cadence was haunting, like a chant or a warning. His heart pounded as he scanned the darkness, the light revealing nothing but rows of silent, watching tombstones. Then he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the cemetery, its back to him. It wore a tattered black cloak and its head hung low, as though in mourning. "Hey, this is private property," Sam shouted, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. The figure didn't move. Sam approached cautiously, the beam of his flashlight steady on the cloaked figure. "You hear me? You need to leave." When he was only a few feet away, the figure turned, and Sam's breath caught in his throat. Beneath the hood was no face, just a yawning void of darkness that seemed to pull at the edges of his vision, drawing him closer. Sam stumbled backward, his legs weak, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it raised a long, skeletal hand and pointed toward the center of the cemetery. Sam turned to look, his body moving against his better judgment. In the middle of the cemetery, a single crypt stood, its iron doors slightly ajar. A faint light flickered within, casting long, dancing shadows across the grass. When he turned back, the cloaked figure was gone. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Sam found himself drawn to the crypt. His feet moved as if under someone else's control, carrying him closer and closer. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. Inside the crypt, the light came from dozens of black candles, their flames unnaturally still. The walls were lined with old, decaying bones, and in the center of the room was a stone slab. On it lay a body covered in a white shroud. Sam's heart pounded as he stepped closer. His hands trembled as he reached for the edge of the shroud, compelled by a force he couldn't resist. He pulled it back and stared into his own lifeless face. The corpse's eyes snapped open, milky and cold, and its lips twisted into a grin. "You're late," it rasped, its voice hollow and echoing. The candles extinguished all at once, plunging the crypt into darkness. Sam screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. When the groundskeeper arrived the next morning, he found the guard shack empty. Sam was gone, but the grave bearing his name now lay filled, the earth freshly packed and undisturbed. No one else dared take the job.
Story number 4.
Lydia was hired to guard the sprawling Baxter Psychiatric Hospital, a decaying facility that had been shuttered for decades. Nestled deep in the woods, the building had a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in the state. Stories abounded of inhumane treatments, patients who vanished, and a particularly infamous wing, the isolation ward, where no one dared enter. Lydia didn't believe in ghosts, but the job paid well, and she wasn't about to let old rumors scare her off. Her first shift started uneventfully. The hospital's halls were long and silent, the peeling wallpaper curling like dead leaves. Her flashlight beam bounced off rusted gurneys and shattered windows, casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. She was to patrol the main floor, check the entrances, and report any signs of trespassing. Around midnight, Lydia began to hear it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. She paused, her heart skipping a beat, and listened closely. It was coming from the second floor. She radioed her supervisor, hoping for instructions, but only static greeted her. Frowning, she decided to investigate. The stairs creaked under her boots as she ascended, her flashlight revealing more decay, broken tiles, scattered papers, and graffiti scrawled in angry red letters. The tapping grew louder as she approached a room at the end of the hall. The plaque on the door read, Patient 4441. Lydia hesitated, her gut screaming at her to turn back, but curiosity pushed her forward. The room was empty, save for a single chair facing a cracked window. She shone her flashlight across the floor, searching for what might have made the noise. Just as she was about to leave, her light caught something scrawled on the wall behind the chair. Get out before it finds you. Lydia's stomach tightened. She stepped back, her foot crunching on something brittle. Looking down, she saw a human tooth lying among the debris. Her flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder. The tapping started again, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from behind her. Slowly she turned, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The hallway was empty, but the tapping continued, echoing around her. Her breath came in short gasps as she retreated toward the stairs, the sound following her like an unwelcome shadow. As she descended, the radio on her hip crackled. A voice, faint and distorted, spoke through the static. Lydia, why are you here? She froze. Who is this? She demanded, her voice trembling. The radio went silent. Then, laughter. Not a warm or joyous sound, but cold, sharp, and mocking. She sprinted back to the security office, slamming the door behind her. The monitors showed various parts of the hospital, but something was wrong. Shadows moved across the screens, darting between rooms. In one feed, the chair in patient 441's room was now facing the door, as if waiting for someone. Lydia's breath hitched as she noticed one of the cameras showed the isolation ward. The feed flickered, and the heavy metal door, which had been locked for decades, was now wide open. The radio crackled again. Come see me, Lydia, the voice whispered, almost sing-song. I've been waiting. The office door rattled violently, as though someone or something was trying to force its way in. Lydia grabbed her flashlight and backed away, her eyes darting between the door and the monitors. On the screen showing the hallway outside her office, a figure appeared. It moved slowly, unnaturally, its limbs jerking as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. The figure stopped outside the office, its face obscured by shadow. Then it smiled. The door burst open, and the flashlight slipped from Lydia's hands, plunging the room into darkness. Her screams echoed through the hospital, but no one came to help. When the morning shift arrived, they found the security office empty. The flashlight was on the floor, its bulb shattered, and the monitors were cracked and black. Lydia's car remained in the parking lot, but she was never seen again. Rumors spread quickly after her disappearance. Some claimed she'd been taken by the restless spirits of the patients. Others believed she'd stumbled upon something far worse. But those who dared visit the hospital swore they could hear her voice at night, whispering from the darkness, "Don't come looking for me."
Story number 5.
Ethan had always worked the night shift, but nothing prepared him for the job at the old Vincent Tower. A crumbling skyscraper that was never completed, the building loomed over the city like a jagged shadow. Developers had abandoned the project years ago after a string of bizarre accidents and mysterious deaths. Now, the tower stood as a decaying shell, home only to the occasional squatter, or so Ethan thought. The first night started quietly. Armed with a flashlight, a two-way radio, and an outdated clipboard for his logs, Ethan patrolled the vast, empty halls of the lower floors. The wind howled through the broken windows, making the whole place feel alive, as though it were breathing. At around 1 a.m., as Ethan stood in the lobby, a faint sound caught his attention. It was distant, like the soft hum of machinery. He frowned, knowing there was no electricity running through the tower. Following the sound, he ascended to the 4th floor. The hum grew louder, joined by faint whispers, just out of earshot but unmistakably human. Ethan's pulse quickened as he entered a wide-open office space. The room was empty, except for an old elevator shaft in the corner. Its doors, rusted and jagged, were slightly ajar. The hum emanated from within the shaft, accompanied by faint, mechanical clicks. Ethan leaned closer, shining his flashlight into the black void. The beam revealed nothing but endless darkness. Just as he stepped back, something slammed against the inside of the elevator doors, a deafening, metallic bang. Ethan stumbled, his heart pounding. The whispers returned, louder this time, coming from all directions. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that was somehow worse. Ethan turned to leave, but his flashlight flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. As he fumbled to get it working again, he felt the temperature drop. His breath came out in visible puffs, and a faint smell of burning metal filled the air. Then he saw them, handprints on the dust-covered windows. They appeared one by one, smearing the glass from the outside. But they were impossibly high, far beyond the reach of any human. Ethan bolted back to the lobby, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Once there, he locked the doors to the security office and tried to calm himself. He turned on the monitors, hoping the cameras would give him a sense of control. The screens flickered to life, showing various parts of the building. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, movement. On one screen, a dark figure darted past the camera on the 6th floor. Another screen showed an empty hallway where the lights flickered erratically, casting long, menacing shadows. On the feed from the 10th floor, a door slammed open and shut repeatedly, as though caught in a violent storm, but there was no wind. And then the worst of all, the elevator shaft. The camera inside the shaft showed nothing but blackness, but then something began to emerge. A pale, emaciated hand gripped the edge of the frame, followed by another. Slowly, a head came into view, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face with a twisted, unnatural grin. It stared directly at the camera as though it could see him. The figure began to climb, pulling itself the walls of the shaft with inhuman speed. Ethan's blood ran cold as he watched it ascend floor by floor, drawing closer to the lobby. The radio on his hip crackled to life. "It's coming," a voice whispered, low and guttural. Ethan dropped the radio and grabbed his flashlight, heading for the emergency exit. As he reached the stairwell, a deafening screech echoed through the building, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing down. Peering back into the lobby, Ethan saw the elevator doors. They were wide open now, revealing a yawning void. From the shadows, the figure emerged, dragging itself across the floor with jerky, unnatural movements. Its limbs bent in ways they shouldn't, and its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan. He ran. The stairwell seemed endless, each floor blending into the next. Behind him, the screeching grew louder, punctuated by guttural growls and the sound of claws scraping against concrete. When Ethan finally burst out into the night, he didn't stop running until he was blocks away. The next morning, he quit. But Vincent Tower wasn't done with him. At home, Ethan began finding strange symbols scratched into his walls, and his dreams were haunted by the gaunt figure crawling out of the elevator shaft. One night, as he sat alone in his apartment, the lights flickered, and a familiar hum filled the air. His reflection in the window grinned back at him, though he wasn't smiling, and then the whisper came from just behind him. "Why did you leave?"
Story number 6.
Mark was hired to guard the abandoned Whitlock factory, a sprawling complex on the edge of town. Once a thriving hub for textile production, the factory had been shuttered for decades after a fire gutted half the building. Local legend claimed the factory was cursed, its halls haunted by the workers who perished in the flames. Mark, skeptical of such stories, shrugged off the rumors and prepared for an easy paycheck. His first night started like any other. The factory was a labyrinth of rusted machinery, collapsed ceilings, and crumbling walls. The air was thick with the scent of old ash and mildew, and every step he took echoed unnervingly in the cavernous space. His job was simple. Make a round every hour, check the perimeter, and log any unusual activity. At 2 a.m., during his second round, Mark noticed something strange. One of the factory's ancient looms, long since inoperable, was humming softly. The sound was faint, like a distant whisper, but unmistakable. He approached cautiously, his flashlight casting long shadows across the room. The loom stood motionless, its gears covered in decades of dust. As he leaned in to inspect it, the hum stopped abruptly. He waited, his heart pounding, but nothing else happened. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to his imagination and moved on. But as he continued his patrol, the atmosphere grew heavier. Shadows seemed to shift in his periphery, and faint sounds echoed through the halls. Footsteps, distant whispers, and most unnervingly, faint laughter. Mark radioed his supervisor. "I'm hearing strange noises. Is anyone else on site tonight?" The response crackled through the static. "Negative, Mark. You're alone out there. Check it out and report back." Uneasy but determined, Mark followed the sounds to the heart of the factory, an area known as the weaving room. This was where the fire had started, and the damage was still evident: blackened walls, melted beams, and a gaping hole in the roof that revealed the night sky. As he stepped into the room, the temperature dropped sharply. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the smell of burnt fabric filled his nostrils. In the center of the room stood a single loom, pristine and untouched by time. Mark's flashlight flickered as he approached. The loom's gears began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, the rhythmic clacking filling the room. Strings of fabric started to spool out, weaving themselves into a strange, intricate pattern. Then Mark saw it: faces. Twisted, agonized faces forming in the fabric, their mouths frozen in silent screams. The loom stopped abruptly, and the fabric tore itself apart, disintegrating into ash. Mark stumbled backward, tripping over a rusted toolbox. As he scrambled to his feet, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with an oppressive cacophony. Shadows moved in the corners, forming vague, human-like shapes that advanced toward him. He bolted, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he navigated the maze of corridors. The whispers followed him, merging into a single voice, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Why are you here?" it demanded, the words reverberating through the building. Mark didn't stop running until he reached the security office. Slamming the door shut, he locked it and backed into the corner. The monitors on the desk flickered to life, showing grainy footage of the factory's various rooms. At first, the screens showed only empty halls and abandoned machinery. Then, movement. Figures began to appear on the monitors, translucent shapes with hollow eyes and charred skin. They staggered through the halls, their movements jerky and unnatural. One by one, the figures turned toward the camera, as though they could see him. On the screen for the weaving room, the loom started spinning again, faster and faster, until the fabric it produced ignited in a burst of flame. The voice returned, low and menacing. "You shouldn't have come." The door to the security office rattled violently. Mark grabbed his flashlight and backed further into the corner, his mind racing. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then, the lights in the office went out. Mark's flashlight flickered to life, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was one of the shadows from the monitors, its form burned and blackened, its hollow eyes fixed on him. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Mark. The last thing he heard before the light went out was the sound of the loom spinning again, faster and louder, drowning out his screams. When the day shift arrived, they found the security office empty. Mark's car was still in the parking lot, and his belongings were untouched. But the monitors were shattered, and in the weaving room, the loom stood silent, its gears coated in fresh ash. No one worked the night shift at Whitlock Factory again.
Story number 7.
James was the newest night guard at Silverline Train Depot, a vast and desolate train yard that had fallen out of regular use. The sprawling lot was littered with rusting train cars, overgrown tracks, and an eerie silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Locals whispered dark stories about the yard, tales of workers who had vanished and ghostly lights that danced between the cars late at night. James didn't believe the rumors. He was a practical man, more concerned with keeping teenagers from vandalizing the trains than chasing ghosts. His first shift began uneventfully. He walked the tracks with his flashlight, the beams cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground. The distant hoot of an owl and the occasional groan of shifting metal were the only sounds to keep him company. By 1 a.m., he was already growing bored. It started with a distant whistle. James froze, his flashlight aimed toward the far end of the train yard. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the sharp, piercing call of a train whistle, though there hadn't been any working engines here in years. The whistle came again, louder this time, followed by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. "Must be a recording or something," James muttered to himself, though his hands tightened on the flashlight. He followed the sound, weaving between the rusted cars. The air grew colder as he approached the source, and the fog thickened until it was almost impenetrable. Then he saw it, a train, gleaming and pristine, parked on a track that should have been abandoned. Its windows glowed faintly, and steam hissed from its engine like a living beast. James blinked in disbelief. He had patrolled this area earlier. There was no train here before. Against his better judgment, he approached. The door to the first car creaked open, inviting him in. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the still night. No response. The warm glow of the train's interior beckoned him, and curiosity got the better of him. Stepping inside, he found himself in a lavishly decorated dining car. The tables were set with fine china and a faint melody played from an unseen gramophone. But the room was empty. As he walked through the car, the train lurched suddenly, and James stumbled. Looking out the window, he saw the yard slipping away, the fog thickening as the train picked up speed. "Impossible," he whispered, panic rising in his chest. He turned to head back, but the dining car was no longer empty. Figures now sat at the tables, silent, motionless, and dressed in old-fashioned clothing. Their heads were bowed as though in prayer, their faces obscured by the shadows. "Excuse me, I didn't mean to intrude," James stammered, backing away. One by one, the figures turned to face him. Their eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and their mouths stretched into grotesque, unnatural grins. The gramophone's melody distorted into a discordant wail as the lights flickered and dimmed. James ran, pushing through the connecting door into the next car. This one was a sleeper car, its narrow corridor lined with closed doors. As he moved forward, the doors began to rattle violently, and a low, guttural moan echoed through the car. He reached the end of the corridor and tried the door to the next car, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, one of the sleeper doors creaked open. A shadowy figure emerged, impossibly tall and hunched. Its long arms scraped the walls as it moved toward him, its head tilting unnaturally as it emitted a low, choking growl. James pounded on the door, desperate to escape. Just as the figure reached him, the door flew open, and he stumbled into the next car, an empty, cavernous baggage compartment. The train shuddered, and James fell to the floor. When he looked up, he saw rows of coffins stacked along the walls, their lids ajar. Whispers filled the air, growing louder and more insistent. "Join us," they hissed, the voices overlapping in a haunting symphony. The coffins began to shake, and skeletal hands clawed their way out. James screamed, scrambling backward as the corpses crawled toward him, their eyeless faces locked onto his. The train jerked to a halt, and James was thrown against the wall. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the train yard, lying on the cold, damp ground. The gleaming train was gone, replaced by the rusted, decaying cars he had patrolled earlier. Shaking, he stumbled to his feet and made his way back to the guard station. His supervisor found him there the next morning, pale and trembling, muttering incoherently about the train. James never returned to the yard. But some nights, the locals swear they hear the whistle of a ghostly train echoing through the fog, its haunting melody calling for the next passenger.
Story number 8.
Elliot had taken the job at Eastwood Shipping Depot to save up some extra cash for the holidays. The warehouse was enormous, filled with towering shelves of abandoned crates covered in years of dust. By day, it bustled with workers moving cargo, but at night it became a silent, suffocating maze where every shadow felt alive. His instructions were straightforward. Patrol the aisles, check the doors, and ensure no one was trespassing. A simple gig, or so he thought. On his third night, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, and an unusual stillness blanketed the space. His first patrol passed without incident, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around midnight, as he checked the farthest corner of the warehouse, he noticed something peculiar. One of the aisles had a crate sitting in the middle of the floor. It was odd because the aisle had been clear the night before. Elliot approached cautiously. The crate was old, its wooden planks warped and splintered. A faded shipping label on its side read, "Do not open." He smirked nervously. "Classic horror movie setup," he muttered. As he turned to continue his patrol, a soft thud came from behind him. He spun around, heart racing, but the crate hadn't moved. Just the building settling, he told himself, though his voice was unconvincing. The rest of his shift passed uneventfully until he returned to the security office. The monitors showed various angles of the warehouse, their black and white feeds flickering faintly. He froze. On one screen, in the aisle where the crate had been, a figure stood. It was tall and impossibly thin, with unnaturally long arms that hung at its sides. Its head was tilted slightly, as if listening. Elliot stared, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't move, but its presence felt oppressive, as though it were staring back through the screen. Gathering his courage, he grabbed his flashlight and headed back to the aisle. His footsteps echoed loudly as he approached. the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hands. When he arrived, the aisle was empty. The crate was still there, but the figure was gone. Relieved but uneasy, Elliot turned to leave. That's when he heard it, a faint, scratching noise coming from inside the crate. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. He reached for his radio, but before he could call for help, the scratching stopped. The silence was short-lived. A low, guttural voice whispered from behind him, "Why did you come here?" Elliot whipped around, his flashlight beam sweeping the aisle. No one was there. He ran back to the security office and locked the door. The monitors flickered again, and the figure was back, this time closer, standing just outside the security office. Its elongated face pressed against the glass of the camera, its mouth twisted into an unsettling grin. The lights in the office flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled with his flashlight, the beam illuminating only a few feet ahead. A loud bang rattled the office door. "Go away!" Elliot shouted, his voice trembling. The banging stopped, but the silence was worse. He heard soft, deliberate footsteps circling the office, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the walls. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. A distorted version of his own voice whispered through the static, "You can't leave." The monitors blinked back on, showing every camera feed. The figure was everywhere. Standing at the end of aisles, lurking in the shadows, its eyeless face turned toward him. Elliot bolted from the office, running blindly through the maze of shelves. The air grew colder, and a thick mist began to seep through the warehouse, distorting everything around him. The footsteps were behind him now, faster and heavier. He turned a corner and saw the crate again, its lid now slightly ajar. From within, a single, pale hand reached out, its fingers impossibly long and clawed. Elliot screamed and fled toward the nearest exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The footsteps stopped, replaced by deep, rasping breaths just behind him. Summoning every ounce of courage, he spun around, but there was nothing there. When the day shift arrived, they found the security office in disarray. The monitors were smashed, and Elliot's flashlight lay on the floor, its lens cracked. Elliot was never seen again. To this day, workers at Eastwood Shipping Depot claim to hear faint scratching noises and see a shadowy figure moving among the shelves late at night. And sometimes they say, the old crate appears in different parts of the warehouse, waiting for its next visitor.
Story number 9.
Claire was a night guard at Halstead Manor, a sprawling estate that had been converted into a museum. Her job was simple: walk the halls, check the exhibits, and ensure no one broke in. The mansion itself was a relic, filled with creaking wood and the faint scent of decay, but the mirror room was what unnerved her most. The room was infamous in the town, the subject of whispered tales and grim warnings. It was an oval-shaped chamber, its walls lined with antique mirrors of all shapes and sizes. Some were cracked, others tarnished, but each one seemed to hold a peculiar depth, as though they reflected more than just their surroundings. Locals claimed the mirrors were cursed, remnants of a long-dead collector who had trapped the souls of his enemies within them. Claire didn't believe in such nonsense, but she avoided the room whenever possible. On her third night, the power went out. The silence of the mansion deepened, and Claire's flashlight seemed feeble against the oppressive darkness. She radioed the museum's maintenance team, but no one responded. The mansion's generator would usually kick in, but tonight it didn't. "Great," she muttered, gripping her flashlight tighter. As she walked through the halls, the mirrors in the mansion seemed to glint unnaturally, reflecting her beam in strange, distorted ways. When she reached the mirror room, she paused. Normally she would skip it, but something drew her in this time. Something she couldn't explain. The door to the room creaked open on its own. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. The room was deathly silent, the air heavy and cold. Her flashlight swept across the mirrors, and for a moment she thought she saw movement. A flicker of shadow darted behind her in the reflection. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Just my imagination," she whispered, though her pulse quickened. She approached the largest mirror in the center of the room, an ornate piece with a gilded frame. Its surface was spotless, yet it seemed to shimmer faintly as though alive. As Claire stared at her reflection, she noticed something strange. Her reflection wasn't moving in sync with her. Her breath caught in her throat. She raised her hand. Her reflection hesitated, then mirrored her action, but its movements were sluggish, almost unwilling. Then it smiled. Claire stumbled backward, her heart pounding. Her reflection's face twisted into a grotesque grin, teeth too sharp and eyes too wide. "Why don't you stay?" it whispered, though her lips didn't move. The other mirrors in the room began to ripple, their surfaces undulating like water. Faces emerged, pale, gaunt faces with hollow eyes and twisted expressions. They pressed against the glass as though trying to break free. Claire ran for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. She banged on it, screaming for help, but the sound was swallowed by the room. The reflections stepped out of the mirrors. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking and twisting as though they were unused to physical form. The largest one, her own reflection, approached her, its grin widening impossibly. "You belong here now," it hissed, its voice echoing through the room. Claire screamed and swung her flashlight, but it passed through the figure as though it were made of smoke. Cold, claw-like hands gripped her arms, dragging her toward the central mirror. She struggled, but the glass began to ripple, pulling her in like quicksand. The last thing she saw before she was consumed was her own reflection, staring back at her from the other side of the glass, its expression calm and serene. The next morning, the maintenance crew arrived to find the mansion in perfect order, except for the mirror room. The central mirror was shattered, and Claire was nowhere to be found. To this day, visitors to Halstead Manor claim to see a shadowy figure in the mirrors, her face twisted in silent horror, as though she's screaming to be let out.
Story number 10.
The cold wind howled through the empty parking lot as Jake arrived for his first shift as the night guard at Mill Creek Storage Facility. The facility was an aging labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, its endless rows of storage units shrouded in shadows. Despite the eerie ambiance, Jake needed the money, and he reassured himself that the job would be quiet and uneventful. The office was small, equipped with a desk, a chair, and a bank of grainy security monitors that displayed various parts of the facility. Jake's supervisor had given him a brief tour earlier that evening, emphasizing the importance of his hourly patrols. "Just check each unit. Make sure no one's tampering with the locks," the man had said, his tone casual but oddly strained. "Oh, and if you hear anything strange, just radio it in. Don't investigate alone." The first patrol passed without incident. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of Jake's footsteps echoing down the concrete halls. He noticed several units had their locks hanging slightly askew, as if they had been tampered with. He made a note to report it in the morning, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Returning to the office, Jake settled in and monitored the screens. A few minutes later, the sound of static crackled through the old intercom system. Startled, he leaned closer. Through the distorted noise, he thought he heard faint whispers, indecipherable but urgent. Gripping the microphone, he called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The whispers ceased immediately, leaving only silence. Shrugging it off as a technical glitch, Jake resumed his rounds. This time, the atmosphere felt heavier. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed darker. As he approached one of the farthest units, he froze. The metal door was slightly ajar. Jake hesitated, recalling his supervisor's warning, but his curiosity got the better of him. Pulling out his flashlight, he pushed the door open and peered inside. The beam of light revealed a cluttered space filled with dusty boxes and old furniture. Just as he was about to leave, a loud bang echoed from deeper within the unit, followed by the sound of something scuttling. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. There was no response. Backing away, Jake hurried to lock the unit and radioed the disturbance, but no one responded. Frustrated and unnerved, he returned to the office. As he sat down, he noticed something chilling on the monitors. One of the cameras displayed a figure standing motionless in the middle of a corridor, its features obscured by shadows. Jake stared, his heart pounding. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to notice the camera. Mustering his courage, he decided to confront it. As he made his way to the corridor, the tension was suffocating. When he arrived, the space was empty. He checked the camera feed on his handheld monitor, and to his horror, the figure was now standing in the office. Jake sprinted back, his mind racing. Bursting into the office, he found it just as he had left it, empty. But when he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him, and the lights flickered violently. The monitors went black, save for one. On it, Jake saw himself sitting at the desk, staring into the camera. But the version of him on the screen wasn't moving. It was smiling, an unnatural, predatory grin that didn't belong to him. The lights went out completely, plunging the office into darkness. Jake fumbled for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck and heard a voice whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." The next morning, the day guard found the office empty. Jake's belongings were still there, but he was nowhere to be found. Security footage showed nothing unusual, just static during the hours he was on duty. Mill Creek storage facility remains operational, but no one lasts long as the night guard. Those who do claim they hear whispers in the dark, see shadows move where they shouldn't, and feel an unshakable sense of being watched. The most unnerving part? Jake's name is still logged into the system, as if he never left.